That was fantastic. As I understand it, I'll ask you a few questions to get us started, then we go to the audience.
Yeah.
So I'm mindful that so many in the audience are also writers and or translators. So I'm kind of asking directed questions. Since this thesis is so good, Nicole and I actually teach your thesis sometimes. I'm sorry. That's embarrassing. But I wonder, could you speak more, like however you want to run with this question, but how did you develop it? Like what shifted, what discipline, what kind of degree of openness? I mean, like, how did you do a great thesis?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I don't know if everybody knows what was actually the origins of this thesis project. I guess, Roger, you kind of mentioned it in the beginning when you were introducing me, but when it first started, it was actually a translation of this contemporary woman writer, Japanese woman writer. It was her autofictional diary entries, and she called them, I think, 5/8 nonfiction, and the rest was fiction. So autofictional diary entries. And I was simply, in the beginning, translating them. But then I started really reflecting on this idea of translation. What does it mean to be a translator, as you do as part of your thesis? Like, you have to think about, like, yeah, who am I as a writer / translator? What am I really doing? What am I doing to the work? So then I was really reflecting on my work and my process as a translator. And I think just one day was like, what if I just reflected on paper in real time? So I would translate and then reflect on each of the entries that I was translating. So luckily, because they were diary entries, they were quite short. And so I would translate, pause, and then reflect and write out the reflection. And I think in the beginning when I was taking thesis workshop, the reflections were very close to the actual translation. And it just didn't feel quite right. It didn't feel like my own voice in a way. It felt like, what am I really trying to accomplish here? But then I think I had a couple of entries that I submitted to the workshop that were very different, that like went in a very different direction from the actual translated entry. And the feedback that I got to those were like, oh my God, I love this, keep going with this. So being in the workshop was actually super helpful, because I was like, oh, maybe I should just let myself go. And like, why am I trying to stick so close to the translation when what I'm trying to do is reflect on them? I should be authentic in my reflection. So then I started, again, just trying to cut away with like borders and restrictions that I feel like I was placing on myself just in general. I think that's something that I have always done in my life. So then I think you were also very encouraging about taking liberties and, you know, just trying your own thing, and what even being creative, what does that even mean? In a lot of ways, it is like getting rid of those restrictions that whatever it is enforces on you. So then it became this really, I thought it was really fun to work on, because the reflections ended up being just so personal. And they almost became like my own diary entries in a way. And then I was able to start seeing them as like a conversation. So then I think eventually I was like, oh, what I'm actually doing is having a conversation with this writer who I'm never actually spoken to, but in writing, we are having a conversation. And then I was like, well, isn't all writing technically a conversation? So I'm just kind of bringing that conversation to the forefront. And yeah, that's how the thesis came about, I guess. And I just kept going with that, and just I did the book, and as soon as like the translation parts, like as soon as I was finished translating, the process also looked different for, I guess, each entry, because sometimes my reflections would come after the translation. So it would be like sitting there, and then I would keep thinking about it, mulling it over, whatever. But sometimes it would come during the translation process. So sometimes, a certain word would be really interesting and I would want to do like a research dive. So for example, like the entry that I read about the blue and the green, I think that was from an entry that I was translating where, she was talking about something that was blue or whatever. And I became like really fascinated by a certain word. And then I started reflecting even before I finished the translation. So again, just like not restricting myself to any sort of method or process and just allowing myself to like reflect on whatever came up for me in my brain at that time. I don't know if that helps anybody, but yeah.
I think it's helpful to hear you speak to it.
Yeah.
Something more specific, which is really relevant to last semester's poetry workshop that I taught, and then this semester in translation, that you seem to just take the apt Japanese and put it right where it's supposed to be. And I have students that question that and like, how much is too much? It's almost like you do like a Goldilocks thing with it. It's like, and do you consciously, like, you just allow like, this is where Japanese would happen? Like, so you let it kind of go, or is that something you have a method for?
Yeah, I don't think I have a method. No, I think it's just whatever feels important to preserve in the Japanese. I think in translation workshops, we talk so much about untranslatable words and moments. And in those moments, I'm like, yeah, why am I translating or attempting to translate? Why not just keep it in the original language? So in that sense, that's like an easy answer, I guess. Like if you can't translate it, then don't. But then there are other moments that just, I don't know, it's hard to put to words when those moments come. I think maybe, for example, I think in one of the entries I just read, like things that are very particular that my mother says, like I just feel like that has to be in Japanese because I hear her saying it in Japanese. She doesn't talk to me ever in English, so why would I, change that? It just feels so inauthentic and like I'm fictionalizing it in a way. And then there's also vocabulary. For example, I think another entry that I just read, this word momoiro, which translates to peach color, which is the color of sakura, the petals of cherry blossoms. I think, I went into this whole spiral because I think a lot of people might say that sakura is pink, but pink has entered the Japanese language as pinku. And pinku is like very showy, like really bright, like just like too much. And like sakura petal is not any of those things. It is very like subtle, almost white. So it is momoiro, which again is strange though, because if you say peach color, if you translate momoiro to peach color in English, then what you imagine is a peach here, which is like the orangish, yellowish, but in Japan, peaches are pink because they have their own type of peaches. So instead of like having to explain all of that, or again, like taking away momoiro by translating it into pink, I just left it in the Japanese because why not?
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
My last question, then we can go to the audience. So you have a complex literacy narrative, like how you learned how to read and write. And it really informs your identity, and it comes through in this book too. I was thinking about you teaching at Queens College now, and I know you're a part of an initiative to bring translation into undergraduate classes, and from your own experience, and you really rocked your job talk. I was present for that. And you took us back, to your origins and actually showed us your childhood writing and like how, like what was impeding you to get to English, right? And the trajectory. And I wondered if you could kind of speak to more about your interest in teaching translation in its broad concept.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I feel like language, it can be so liberating. It can give you so much power. It gives you a voice. It is, I mean, again, just like this form of releasing something. But at the same time, I think language can be so restricting and so limiting and silencing. And I think I experienced that, especially when I moved here from Japan when I was 9 and I spoke no English. And I just still remember that like visceral like fear, just being anywhere out. School, I guess, was pretty much the only place I was going when I was 9. But yeah, I just felt so scared. And I remember being walked to my classroom and the teacher like introducing me, whatever. And she's like, does anybody here speak Japanese? And crickets, like nobody in the class spoke any Japanese. And there was not a single Japanese student in the entire school. So I was like a pretty outgoing kid in Japan. I had this like amazing childhood growing up in the countryside in Japan. And I loved talking to people. I loved playing with other kids and whatever. So then to go from there to the situation where I just like couldn't do any of those things. And then I just remember I couldn't even like ask to use the bathroom. I didn't know like how to copy notes. So I was literally copying the alphabets that I was seeing on the board. And so it would take me like 20 minutes to copy down like one sentence because I was going by each alphabet. And I was like actually writing to J the other way because there's a letter in Japanese that is shi, so it's that way. But the J is the opposite anyway. So I was going through all of that, and it was a really, really tough time in my life. And all I wanted to do was to speak, and all I wanted to do was to write. And the excerpt that I showed during my job talk was actually when I was in 4th or 5th grade, I started writing in both languages. So whenever we had like an assignment, I was totally the teacher's pet, by the way. So I just like had to do all of the assignments, even though the teachers were very kind. They were like, oh, Rebecca, if you don't understand, you don't have to do this. But I was like, no, I want to do the thing that everybody else is doing. So I would write out the answers or whatever I needed to write out. But whenever I didn't know the word in English, I would just write it in Japanese. And luckily, I had really great teachers who were very supportive of this. But I will say some of my classmates were like, what is this? Like, I can't read what you're writing. And so it was definitely, I got like feedback both ways. But that's how I began to really express myself. And then eventually I became, I guess, more fluent in English. So I stopped doing that. But I just feel like, you know, why aren't we just doing that in order to write or to think? Why are we limiting ourselves to a single language? And it feels like the reason we are limiting ourselves to one language is because there's like a certain standard and, you know, you're supposed to be doing that according to academia or professionalism or whatever it is. But that to me feels so unfair. And so with my teaching, I really want to push my students to use all of their languages too, in the same way that I was doing in 5th grade or 4th grade. And definitely sometimes it's like strange to them because I think in high school they have not done anything like that. But I'm like, yeah, why not? Just try it out. And I don't mean different language. If students speak English and no other like name language, then they can try out with different Englishes. So write in like texting English, their draft, or use emojis or whatever. So I just want to view language as a source of, again, just like liberating and releasing rather than something that is super restricting. And if we limit ourselves into like one language, I think that can often happen. And that causes insecurity. And I think I personally suffered a lot from imposter syndrome because of this. And it's like, it affects you in so many different ways. And it's not just in the classroom. It goes really outside of the classroom too. So I guess that's how I started. Yeah, that was really my topic for my job talk. I just want students to, again, liberate themselves through language. And that often means mixing languages. And I think that's beautiful.
That's fantastic. Please.
I wanted to know, how did you determine which Japanese words or characters to put a footnote to?
Oh, that's a good
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I tried to be funky with the footnotes too. And by funky, I mean like, I want to push back against the very idea of footnotes, because I feel like footnotes are often in like academic texts. Me personally, and I think a lot of people can relate, hopefully, we don't like footnotes. They're kind of like a turnoff. But I feel like footnoting is, in a way, marginalizing. And I have often existed in the margins. So it was my way to sort of push back against marginalization by putting things that would not often be in a footnote, if that makes sense. So there are certain entries where like the footnote takes up like the whole page, or I just like really get into it. And I do that definitely on purpose because I want footnotes to also take up space. And that also goes back to me as a translator. Like I want translators to also be able to take up space. So yeah, and there are definitely moments where I also footnote some English words in Japanese because I don't want the footnotes to just serve the English speaking readers. I want them to also be useful for Japanese speaking readers. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah, okay, cool.
Comments, please?
So this was your thesis project. Is this literally, did the thesis just become the book, or was there further revision or addition or anything in turning into the book?
Yeah, there was definitely further revisions, mostly because I had to take out the translations. In the end, the translations, I don't know if I explained this, but the translations had to be taken out. Ultimately, I don't recommend this to the translation students, but I submitted it to the contest without securing the rights first. And then, oops, don't do that.
You felt like you were getting, like somebody said something, kind of.
Well, okay, so the thing is, I did inquire with her agent in the US for a different project years before. Okay. And then they sort of ghosted me. They were kind of like, yeah, maybe. And then I sent them some of my work, and then they never said anything back. But that project I sort of didn't pursue anyway. So I was like, okay, it's fine. I don't need to follow up. But for this one, because I had won the prize, I was like, okay, I really need to get the rights now. But yeah, this is why I don't recommend doing it that way. But because also the writer that I was translating is a very prominent writer who has won a bunch of awards, and she already has translators that work with her that, translate her books into English. There was a lot of hesitance, a lot of back and forth, which ultimately became a no. So this was like a year and a few months ago, I think January 2023. And I totally made it into this catastrophe for myself where I was like, oh my God, this is a horrible way to start the year. Like, what am I even doing? It was a terrible time. But then I spoke to Caroline Hagood, who is the editor at Hanging Loose. And she was like, actually, we can still publish it without the translations. And I was so, like, I didn't expect that. So I felt so happy, but also like, okay, now what do I do though? Because the translations were like the spine of my work. If half of my project is taken out, then what is it going to look like? It's going to look like halfway done? I don't know. So then I went back in there and I began the revision process and the editing process. And I did end up putting in more entries just to make it, I guess it was sort of like transitioning. And this book is like divided by like themes. So there was more to say for me regarding some of those themes that came up for me. So I added those entries. I also ended up taking away some of the entries. So yeah, it definitely changed from when it was a thesis. But I think the heart of it is very much still there. So yeah.
How much of that came through conversations with your editor, and how much were you just deciding?
Yeah, I mean, she was actually pretty hands-off with the project, but there were moments where I would send her new entries that I wanted to add, but for whatever reason, last year I was writing these like really long prose entries, and she's like, so what's going on with those? Like, this doesn't really fit into the style of the rest of the entries, but she like, phrased it really kindly. So she's like, okay, this is very different. Are you sure this fits? So in those moments, she was definitely like, yeah, maybe make sure that, you have this style and you kind of maybe want to keep that consistent. But in terms of like content or anything, she was very much like, yeah, you do your thing. And yeah, she was such a great reader too. And was like, yeah, she was so supportive. So, yeah.
Rebecca, we've got a question from Amanda Long
Great.
in the chat. Question for Rebecca. Can you talk a bit about experimenting with poetic form, structure, and how that informed and or complicated your translation process?
Yeah. First of all, hi, Amanda. Thank you for the question. I mean, I think how that came about, like experimenting with poetic form, I don't think it came to me until I took thesis workshop, honestly, and I was taking it with a lot of poets. And at first I was very afraid because, I don't know, I feel like I've always been afraid of poetry. But then I was resonating so much with the poetry submissions from my cohorts, and they're just so beautiful. And I think as part of that workshop, we were also assigned to read a lot of poetry. And I think I started like really diving into poetry and falling in love with it and wondering to myself, like, why was I not doing this earlier? And because the entries that I was translating were so small, they're like micro prose, I guess, they felt very poetic. And this writer, she is a prose writer, but I think a lot of her entries were so poetic and so profound. She would write about like the most mundane things of her like walking around Tokyo or something, but then would just have these like really profound moments in there that felt very poetic to me. And so I was really inspired by that. And then with my reflections, as I mentioned earlier, I wanted to, again, just like get rid of the guardrails and react to the entries in whatever way I wanted. And so I think that's when like the poetry started coming in. I try to really just pay attention to the language rather than trying to make it sound a certain way, I guess. Whatever felt important is what I would like latch onto. So like certain words or sentences or sounds that like felt just something from the translation that I wanted to put into my reflections. And I think that's when it really became like, I guess, poetry rather than prose. But yeah, and then I think I really found my way into writing these like very short micro prose, which is like kind of hard to determine if that's poetry or prose. I think I definitely am in the middle of those two, and I feel very comfortable being in that middle, in that, I guess, liminal space between poetry and prose. I love it. I love it here.
I'm curious, so I love how the project started as like a more traditional translation and these reflections and ultimately like spun off into your own book and really your own work. How has that project affected like other translation work that you do or anticipate doing, since you kind of like just busted this whole thing open? Like, what does it look like then to be translating someone's text and potentially like needing to stick closer to the original? But I know I just imagine it has to have impacted that process. I'm curious.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I will admit I have not been translating as much since this project because I then wanted to write nonfiction, and I've been writing a lot of creative nonfiction. And I wonder if that's also because of this book, actually, because the reactions, the reflections that I was writing were creative nonfiction pieces. But yeah, I think definitely I might maybe take more time thinking about my relationship to the text as a translator. So I don't think I need to be like publishing another book where I do the same thing, where I'm like translating and reflecting on each piece. Like, I don't think I need to do that again, but I think I'm doing that more subconsciously, like in my mind. And it's something that I'm more aware of. As a translator, like I'm always questioning, like, who am I as the translator of this current poem that I'm looking at? What kind of word choices am I making? And how much of that is because of like me and my interpretation and what I have experienced and how I language? In a way that I guess I wasn't doing before writing this book, because that was more, I guess, felt a little bit more mechanical in a way, felt more like puzzle pieces or like trying to fit together puzzle pieces. But now it feels more like I'm trying to make this like very genuine connection with the original piece. Yeah.
Please. May I just say that this is such a wonderful translation work. I'd like to ask if you have any advice for aspiring nonfiction or fiction Asian American writers.
That's a great question. I have the same question, honestly, but no. No, do you have it? No, but I mean, yeah, I mean, I think what gave me permission to write this were other Asian American writers. And I was reading so many works by Asian American writers that like almost in a way gave me permission, because I felt like as an Asian American person, I'm always seeking like permission and like validation, like, am I allowed to do this or not? I don't know. But one book that I read, Minor Feelings by Kathy Park Hong, I was reading that while I was working on this. And she just like talks about this feeling that Asian Americans usually carry because we are supposed to, the model minority, right? Like we are supposed to be the model minority. And because of that, we are living with this, this like very subtle feeling of rage. It's like really hard to articulate. But because so many other Asian American writers have now begun to do that work, I felt like I could like jump on that train and join them. And I really think we should not feel like we're ever writing alone. We're always writing in collaboration with others, in conversation with others. So I guess my advice would be like to ask yourself, like, where are you in that conversation with all the other Asian American writers? And how would you like to continue that conversation? Yeah.
We have a question, another one in the chat. This is from Shi Wang. Hi, Professor Suzuki. I enjoyed your reading so much. Thank you. The entry about, quote unquote, having your heart in two places really hit home for me. May I ask, has your reflection changed after you've written this piece? Did you find something new as you revised the part?
Yeah, I think the initial reactions or the reflections, I try not to touch too much, actually, because I think they kind of need to be preserved in that moment, because again, I was like reacting to the translations. So for those entries, I did kind of keep intact, I think. But overall, the entries definitely like morphed. And again, as I mentioned before, like I added some entries, I took out some entries, things happened in my life that felt like very irrelevant when it came time to publishing this. So there were definitely moments where, again, like I was putting in different sorts of revisions in order to fit the writer that I am now, as opposed to where I was when I was writing my thesis, which is maybe a couple years before the book came out. So yeah, I guess the answer is like a yes and a no. Yeah, most entries stayed intact, didn't really try to revise, but then there's definitely some additions and subtractions and also a little bit of tweaking here and there. Yeah.
A couple more questions, please.
That's more of like more of a production or publishing question, but how did you decide to have the image of the eggplant on the cover of your book? And did you make a deliberate choice to have that piece be at like the halfway point of the book, or was that like a happy accident?
That is definitely a happy accident. So thank you for pointing that out. But yeah, the eggplant, I just like immediately knew I wanted this as a cover because Obon is like the holiday that I used to love as a child. I still do love as a child. I mean, I still do as an adult. Yeah, I think this book very much is about my ancestors. It's about spirits. It's about my connection to my home and the people that came before me. And Obon is definitely like that holiday of like crossing the two worlds, like the ancestors coming back and being able to spend time with me and be in this world with me. And it's just like a holiday that's really hard to articulate and explain to people who are not Japanese. So I kind of wanted to make it the cover because then because people would ask questions and ask like, what does it even mean? Like, what is this, And I think that's a great way to get people talking about your book too. And yeah, from like the publishing perspective, like marketing too, like, you want to have a beautiful cover for your book. And I was really lucky with Hanging Loose. They're basically like, you can do whatever you want for your cover, which initially, yes, it freaked me out because I'm like, well, I don't know. But then I have an artist friend in Japan and I just gave him this idea, Obon, eggplant, ocean, moon, can you work with that? And then he did this. So he really understood the assignment. Yeah. Yeah.
That's so great.
Yeah.
Please, Amanda.
I have a question. So you came into this project, I'm assuming, like, you thought of yourself as a translator, and like that's kind of where you were operating from. How has that changed since then, considering now you're writing nonfiction, you're also writing poetry? Do you think of yourself, do you identify with any of those kind of limiting categories, or do you think of yourself as like everything or nothing at all? Kind of?
I love that. Yeah, and it kind of is like the moon thing. Like we can be a slice of an orange and also a shrimp and everything we want to be. I think I like to think of myself as everything, and not to say that I'm like expert in everything, but I want to try everything. I came into the program really like sticking to translation, and I always just like thought of myself as a translator and nothing else. But again, just like being in community with so many creative people and creative people that were working in so many different genres, I think I had a moment where I was like, wait, why am I just sticking to the one thing when there's so many different things? And like, how do you know if you're good at it if you don't try it? And I think so. Yeah, the MFA was pretty good for me, obviously, because of that, because you are able to, dabble in different genres and try it out. So I guess I am right now in this current moment, leaning towards creative nonfiction and writing a lot of that, but I never want to let go of myself as a translator. I also want to write more poetry. So I guess it depends on when you ask too. Yeah.
So we have time for a last question before we... Oh, please. Jay.
Oh, I was going to ask about as you were like revising for publication alongside additions and subtractions. Did you rearrange the sequence and kind of like unmarry the sequence from the translated autofiction that the new writing was originally paired with?
That's a great question. I actually did not change the order because during my thesis, that was like the one thing that I spent so much time on. And I actually covered my bedroom walls with the pieces because I was trying to figure out like where everything fit. So the thing that I did was actually break the order of the translation. So again, I was reflecting on translations, right? And that had a specific order, and I was translating them in order. But at the end, I was like, I don't want it to be in that order though, because some of the reactions, there was like some sort of pattern that I was noticing. For example, I write about Obon a lot, and I kind of wanted those pieces to be closer to each other. Or I would write about like certain moments of my life a few times, and I wanted those pieces to go together. So what I ended up doing was really messing the order of the translations or the original. However, it felt more like my project then. And again, because it was a thesis project, I could do whatever I want, which was great. And because I spent so much time figuring out like the order in my thesis project, I was like, okay, that actually is set in stone. And what I ended up doing with the revision was like, if some of those sections were lacking some entries, then I ended up adding a few things or taking out things that felt like not really relevant or whatever. But the order I kept for sure.
Fascinating. I had no idea.
Yeah.
Well, and you added sections, right? Because there wasn't sections originally.
I think that was actually the editor who suggested that. Yeah. So
helps with the readability of it.
Right, I think so. So the section names and stuff, those were actually, my editor suggested that.
So a good editor will do that sometimes.
The translation ended up being something like a temporary scaffolding, right?
Yeah.
That's so interesting. It's an interesting way to put it.
Right.
Just used.
Yes.
So it's like a return to the ghosting. I mean, your retort.
Yes.
But it's still like a ghost, right? But it's still like a ghost. It sounds like it's also still like a ghost scaffold in the project, right? If you know the other text, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
And you like that metaphor.
I love it. And also Jay, who wrote my review, I think you mentioned the ghostly aspect of the translation, which I really, really love. So
I mean, it's just like the first Queens College event I ever attended as an admitted student. I think it was your thesis reading, and I got admitted as a translation student. And I was watching it, and I was like, "Oh, you can do that. You don't have to." It's been a big part of my Queens College.
That is so cool. That's a great one to end on. We are going to continue the conversations. There's a book signing table. You can buy a book and get it signed. There's refreshments and and there's great art painting as well. 2 different ways to get there. Right? You can go help me thank Rebecca.